All right. So now how are we all doing? We're all ready to go. I just came from Cancun doing a little swimming in the ocean. Everybody ready to go? Cool little boats. Yeah, I have to say, my parents never went to movies much. So whenever I went to a movie, I went by myself. And this movie came out when I was 11. So I went and watched this movie by myself. And I loved it. I thought it was the greatest movie of all time. But I am still now to this day, I went to get my PhD at the University of Southern California. And I learned how to scuba dive there. And I have to say, just going into the ocean without, I have to be under the water so I can look all the way around because I'm just petrified in the ocean if I'm treading water with my head above water. Just totally petrified. Simply because, still from when I was 11, from watching this film. And I remember one of the first times I was doing some research in Maryland. And I was collecting shark's teeth and whale bones and stuff from the Calvert Cliffs in Maryland. And on the East Coast, the water is very shallow for a long way out. And I was out watching. I looked out. It was the first time I'd been on the East Coast. And I saw hundreds of what looked like these dorsal fins coming out of the water. And then they'd flop back in. I was freaking out a little bit. And it turned out they were all eagle rays swimming around. And they were flipping up sideways and then swimming and flipping back down. But this movie had my heart rate going probably about 140 when I saw that. So a movie like this is fantastic, but it can have an effect on you for a long time. But it did make me respect and really appreciate sharks, and I think they're very cool. And now you think I'd be safe from sharks, but actually Kansas is a place that had lots of sharks swimming around right overhead about 80 million years ago. Some cool things. We know that great whites do jump out of the water if you've ever watched Shark Week and watched them in South Africa. There's lots that's been learned about sharks since 1975. Sharks, females are the bigger ones, right? And the females, the largest ones, get to be about 20 feet long. The largest white shark ever caught was about 23 to 24 feet long. The shark in Jaws, as you heard them say, was 25 feet long. All right, so 25 feet is not much bigger than the largest white sharks that have been caught. Only, I don't know if you may have caught briefly when the shark swam by, it had claspers on it, which meant that in the movie this was supposedly a male shark. But male great whites only get to be usually about 14 feet in length. So they're actually quite a bit smaller than the females are. One of the things that's been learned new about white sharks is it used to be thought that they would mature in 10 to 20 years, depending on males a little bit sooner because they're smaller. But in 2014, we learned in a paper published that it's really the females take 33 years to reach sexual maturity, and the males take 26 years to reach sexual maturity. So that's a big difference, and they live to be 70 or over 70 years old. So the larger the shark, the older it probably is also. So there are fascinating long-lived species. And there's a couple other things that we'll talk about a little bit as we go through the slideshow a little bit. But other things that are cool about white sharks is that when they do reproduce, they are what we call ovoviviparous, which means there's some sharks that lay egg sacs. And other sharks, the eggs they actually have eggs inside, and then the little sharks bust out of the eggs and then are given live birth. And great white sharks then have live birth. But talk about little eating machines. Females will give birth to 2 to 14 pups every other year or so. But inside, the little sharks, they bust out of the egg sacs, and they will eat their siblings or eat some of the eggs that haven't been. So they're talk about eating machines. They're starting before they're even born. It is a shark eat shark world for them. They're talked about how fast they were. The boat was chasing after them. They can swim up to 35 miles an hour, which is about as fast as your racehorses in the Kentucky Derby. So you're not very many things that are going to outswim them. Let's see here. Another one of the cool things about sharks in general, came on the planet over 400 million years ago. Some of the first animals. They haven't changed in shape a whole lot. But one of the cool things, they're not just ovoviviparous, but they were the first animals on the planet to have internal fertilization. So the males have claspers that are inserted, so they have sex. And they were the first animals to actually have intercourse, internal fertilization. Just kind of a fascinating thing. Oh, this way. This way.
Please go.
This way. Maybe not.
Maybe not.
All right. One of the things also interesting about sharks is when they're small, they're basically great whites are fish eaters. And they will eat fish and other sharks and things until they're reach about 13, about at least 10 feet long. After they get to be 10 to 12 feet long, oh, there we go. It worked. After they get to be about 10 to 12 feet long, their diet switches to where they're mostly eating marine mammals. They're eating pinnipeds. They're eating seals and sea lions. They're eating dolphins. And they keep that diet. As you can see, sometimes they jump out and nail them and carry them out of the water. They chase dolphins down from the rear because they don't want to get caught by the sonar, or dolphins will know they're coming. So they do have this big dietary change. And one of the ideas that they talked about in the movie also was that they suggested that they were territorial. And one of the things that we know now is that's because they stay on the coast and they're feeding in shallow water. Well, there's a couple interesting things. They were talking about, oh, they're feeding at night. That's the time to go out after them. But if they're eating seals and sea lions, they're going to be eating when the seals and sea lions are in the water, not out of the water. And so a lot of times the sea lions, they come out at night and they go back in swimming because they're going fishing visual during the day. So the reality is the great whites are going to be feeding during the day. When you've got the elephant seals, they'll eat walruses. They will eat any sort of marine mammal out there, and they really like lots of body fat. So but because these pinnipeds and things are usually coastal, that's why the idea came around that maybe they're territorial. They take a little chunk of coast. But we now also know that these sharks will make really interesting migrations. They've been found as deep as 4,000 feet below sea surface level. And they will cruise from the elephant seals around San Francisco or down to LA and head out to Hawaii and come back. And they're probably going down to very deep levels when they're making some oceanic crossings to different feeding areas. We also know that in South Africa and places, they will actually swim in sort of clans of 2 to 6 white sharks. So they have a little bit of sociality, but it's fascinating because they really don't like to be close to each other because they will bite and really hurt each other pretty badly. But they have a very sort of pecking order. The largest gets to go hunt, eat first, which means the females get to go first because they're the bigger ones. And also, the ones that are there first usually have higher priority than the ones that come in later. So there is some sociality to them, despite their lifeless eyes. And another thing that's fascinating, if we can make it work. Which way were you shooting at it?
There you go.
Oh, there we go.
That's the right direction.
They will also eat whales. They're usually dead whales, so they're scavenging. And they really love whales because lots of blubber, so there's lots of fat. They can eat large chunks out of whales, and it'll keep them satisfied for several months because there's a lot of fat to be digested. And interesting, when they are munching on whales, they will come up and they will eat 2 or 3 at a time because they got a big whale, so and they don't fight each other so much. They can share when they've got a big meal. But once they eat that much, they're like us at Thanksgiving, right? It's time for a nap. They get lazy and sometimes end up rolling over on their backs and they fall asleep, and they're just very lazy. They come back up and they can't even bite strong enough to take off any more chunks of meat off of a whale because they're so full and they get weak. There's one idea that perhaps they might even use this for mating because it becomes a little bit safer to get close to each other.
First. Way out. There's a sensor side.
Oh, there we go.
Amen.
Another cool thing about white sharks is with most fish, sharks are ectothermic, or we call cold-blooded, so they're going to be the temperature of the water. White sharks and some tuna are actually a bit endothermic. And it's not so much that their metabolism is just generally high like mammals and birds, but they're swimming, the muscles generate enough heat that they're able to keep their body temperature higher than the temperature of the water. So they are a bit endothermic or warm-blooded in that sense, which means that they can cruise around all over the place and be very active. And this is just a map that sort of shows anywhere between the red lines into the center is the territory where you can find white sharks. They generally live in water between 55 and 75 degrees. So it's a pretty wide range of temperatures. But oops, hey, I flipped again. I wasn't quite ready for that. We're going the wrong way. Go backwards.
Yeah, okay.
But the point being is they don't go in the real Arctic waters or the Antarctic waters. It's too cold. Right? So they don't really like being in the really tropical waters because it's too warm. So they like being in these areas where the water's cool, to a bit cold, but not really cold. So they are limited a little bit by temperature, but they have a fairly wide range because they can swim and raise their body temperature through their activity, which is a pretty cool thing. So the dark red patches is where you find lots of them, right? And it's a lot of coasts that are highly productive. So there's lots of fish, which means there's lots of marine mammals for them to munch on. All right, now we can try it. There. Okay, so one of the things that's interesting, that's a 25-foot shark, which was absolutely terrifying, and it made this boat look pretty small. But if we look at a lot of sharks through time, this is our 15, 16-foot great white shark. And this is scaled to the size of other sharks. All right. What's interesting is that the sort of laminid sharks start back in the Cretaceous with sharks like this. This shark swam in Kansas. This is called a Cretaceous, and you can tell it's the same size to a little bit bigger. It's probably a 20 to 25 foot shark, and we've got some of the fossils of it at the Sternberg, such as this is a cool vertebra. One of the things that's really also cool about sharks starting from the Cretaceous through today, is that you can find the vertebra. Anybody have an idea why that's surprising?
Because they're cartilaginous.
Because they're cartilaginous. So if you go back 200, 300, 400 million years ago, you can find shark teeth because they're phosphatized. They've got enamel. But you don't find any of the vertebra. So you're guessing how big they are just by looking at their teeth. But starting in the Cretaceous, there was enough calcium and that the vertebra start to calcify. They don't become bone like fish bone, so the xiphatinus from the Cretaceous. But one of the things that's cool is there are these discs that are calcified, and you can tell them apart from some of the big fish vertebra because they're flat, thin little discs instead of sort of big rounded discs. And you can tell them apart from other sort of organisms like in the Cretaceous we have Mosasaurs and Plesiosaurs because they've got all these extra little bumps and knobs on them, and they're convex on one side and concave on the other, so they look very different. So you can pick the animals out, but it's neat because now we've found whole lengths of the vertebra of a single individual, so we can really measure how long they were, even from the fossil record. So what's interesting is we said the white shark is a Carcharodon. And what's the biggest shark that we know about ever in the history of the planet? A megalodon, right? But a megalodon's a species name. It used to be called Carcharodon megalodon, and that's this guy right here. Just for scale, this is a whale shark,
The largest fish.
right? So, but we have a big argument about whether this is really truly an ancestor of a great white shark. And we think probably it's not now. It's been moved to a different genus called Carcharodon. And there's some evidence that maybe the white sharks are more closely related to makos and things like that, which are over here. But if you go back to just after the Cretaceous, we have this cool guy right up here, which is called Otodus, and it was the beginning of the lineage of the big megatooth sharks. And so any of the big sharks up here with the white bottoms and the gray are related to Megalodon, but they're earlier ones. So you can see the lineage getting bigger and bigger, starting 60 million years ago with this guy, and they lived till 38 million years ago. So they lived for, the genus was around for 20 million years. The next biggest one up there is Carcharodon chubatensis, and it was around from 28 to 5 million years ago. The Megalodon was around from about 20 to 24 million to 2 million years ago. So a lot of these big sharks overlapped with each other, but you could see that they're getting bigger and bigger. And the Megalodon went from lower limits of about 42 feet long to a maximum of 60 feet long.
They might not notice.
So, one of the reasons of why did they get so big, and one of the reasons is because they started preying on very large food sources. But besides looking at this, you can do the next one. Here's our little bitty white shark, which was terrifying us in the movie. And here's a Megalodon, which is slightly more terrifying. Fortunately, they're not around anymore, despite a History Channel show a couple of years ago. I think it would be hard for them to hide very much, because one of the things about these guys is their diet. Oh, this gives you another cool idea. We've actually found jaws of megalodons with teeth in them, and that gives you another idea of how our little terrifying 25-foot shark would survive in an ocean with the really big ones. Oh, teeth. Megalodon teeth are found all over the East Coast, North Carolina, Florida, South Carolina. A lot of times up in rivers. People go scuba diving for them in rivers. They're fairly decently sized. The nice 25-foot sharks that we have in Kansas, the Cretaceous, are about yay big, for scale. And these are getting close to our regular white shark's teeth that we have today. Oh, let's try another one. Interestingly enough, when the megalodons were swimming around, there were there was another huge predator, affectionately called the Leviathan. And it's a sperm whale. But unlike sperm whales today, who go down deep and eat squid, these guys probably also ate other marine mammals. They're about 13.5 meters, close to the same size as the megalodons, but not quite. If you go back to the Cretaceous, we had Mosasaurs. They were bigger than any of the sharks that were around in the Cretaceous, the large ones, but there was lots of small ones too. So Mosasaurs, Plesiosaurs, and big Cretaceous, they ate each other depending on who was bigger, which was adult, which ones were juvenile. But there were some pretty big predators in the Miocene. Try again. What else we got? The earliest big whale is back in the Eocene, and it's actually the state fossil of Alabama. It's called Basilosaurus. It looks a little bit more like a mosasaur, which was from the previous picture, but it's actually a whale. And it was very predatory, but it actually has a pretty small head and a really long body. About 19, this guy would have been just about 60 feet long. So about lengthwise, very similar to the Megalodon. Oh, this lived a lot earlier. The biggest sharks were only about 35 feet long back then when this guy was around. So there's all kinds of cool big animals. But here's what they ate. The Miocene especially was a time when we started getting not toothed whales, but baleen whales, or mysticetes. And they started just diversifying all over the oceans. And there was a group that went towards the right whale lineage. There was some that went towards the gray whale lineage. So there was lots of diversification of different large baleen whales. And they became food for the large sharks. Most of these baleen whales in the Miocene, when Megalodon was around, were only about 35 feet, 40 feet long. So the Megalodon, being 40 to 60 feet long, was just as big or bigger. So there was a burgeoning food source for really large sharks. And as I said, there's overlap between a lot of these huge sharks. So there would have been overlap because of different sizes of marine mammals in the Miocene with the sizes of the big sharks. So there was getting to be a big food source, which allowed for some really big predators. Oh, and so we have to watch how they take chunks out of whales to eat because it's just so much fun. So probably, I'm not sure they would have even messed with smaller dolphin-sized things because there were dolphins around too. That's where some of the smaller giant sharks were probably eating, whereas the largest ones were probably fixated on the larger whales. And one of the hypotheses for why these guys died out 2 million years ago is that we really started our ice ages about then. So the Earth really cooled down, and a lot of the whales would go up to the high Arctic, Antarctic latitudes, in the summer especially, to feed on all the krill, because it's highly productive, and perhaps cold enough waters where these guys couldn't move to, couldn't follow them around, which takes away a bit of a food supply issue. Plus, a lot of those guys started to reduce in numbers, so it made it tough for the big sharks. This is an interesting one that I said we have great white sharks today, and the Megalodon lineages are suggested to be 2 different genera. This is just a blown up great white shark tooth of today to scale to the same size as a Megalodon. And you can see these guys are very flat. These guys are recurved and thicker instead of more like a blade. So they're both triangular, which is why they were originally thought to be the same group. But now it's suggested that there's 2 different lamniform or giant shark lineages, which is kind of cool. All right, let's see what else we got. All right, so Kansas during this time. There's a lot of different sharks living in Kansas, swimming up and down what we call the Western Interior Seaway. All right, Cretaceous was sort of the largest of the very nasty carnivorous ones, but there was a lot of them at different sizes. Squally Corax, Cretaceous, Cartabiodon were all sort of fusiform, fast-swimming, nasty sharks. And I've got teeth of a lot of them up here, but the other thing that's fascinating is sharks diversified to lots of cool different things, like this is Tychotis. Tychotis is cool because it has teeth that look like this, or like flat, rounded buttons. And they find them in just a whole plate, like a whole pallet full of these buttons. And so they swam around and they munched on clams and things. They were shell crushers, so they swam around on the bottom. But they were still awfully large, and it helped to be large so you didn't get eaten by the Cretaceous. But there were huge clams in the seaway called inoceramids. They were monsters, right? So it was really important to have some good shell crushing ability. There was lots of them around, so it was a good food source. There are also these little goblin sharks, and Hybotis was cool because it was a hybrid. It ate some fish, but it might crush some shells. It's a little guy, but it was around since the Permian. So it survived for 100 million years. It was still around in the Cretaceous, and it started out in Kansas, even in the Permian. So a very long-lived lineage. As being a generalist, it kind of survived. Let's see what else we got here. All right, this is just showing now again the sizes. There's a human scale, there's your Megalodon, and your great white, and then your Cretaceous. So lots of large, this is your other Carcharocles, or related to Megalodons, that a whole suite of them in large sizes. So I think the main take home, oh, here we go. I said sharks started about 400 million years ago. This is the first shark. They started out, that's actually pretty big for 400 million years ago because there weren't a lot of big things to eat, but a reasonable sized thing. Still might want something bigger than your bass boat to go fishing for them, but a little bit more reasonable in size. And it still looks pretty much like a shark. Right, let's go. There we go. All right, so I wasn't sure how big the group was going to be, so I brought some shark's teeth, but I also have, these are pictures of the Cretaceous shark teeth that we have in our collection at the Sternberg. So this is a Cretoxy tooth, so you can get the shape of them. It's still got a little bit of that V shape, flattened, some little serrations, kind of like white sharks. And you see how big that one is. This is the Tylosaurus, so there's your button flattened shell-crushing teeth. Go through these. There we go. There's another one of the big, you can tell what kind of prey it's got, but it's got these denticles on either side of the main tooth, and they're only very slightly recurved, and a couple, 3 centimeters long. Next. Cretaceous. Nice sort of U-shape, narrow, longer tooth with a couple of denticles on each side, and do a pretty good job of slicing you up. Next, Cretaceous. Now we have Cretolamina. The credo part is Cretaceous, and we also talk about the denticles. A lamina means it's a lamniform shark, kind of like great white sharks. But fairly decent-sized teeth and fairly large, probably 10 to 15 foot long sharks. Squally Corax, another very common one for Kansas, and they live not just from the Cretaceous, but into the Paleocene, into the Eocene. You can find them in the Miocene. So these guys lived for a long time. Also, a very successful group, lots of different species from this genus, but you can tell they have very sort of angled, recurved teeth. So much shorter, not as long, but much more dense. And very have denticles, so they're very sharp, very good at slicing things open. Another 15 to 20 foot long shark. This is the Hybotus. I said started in the Permian, but was still around. And it really probably it's not just a generalist in what it could eat, it was also pretty small. So it could stick around in places and sort of be nondescript. And, but it still would have been preyed on quite a bit by the other larger sharks. And Scapanorhynix is the Goblin Shark. And again, a smaller group of sharks. Different sorts of fish. We had fish. One of the cool things about the Cretaceous is why in the seaway in Kansas we have these rocks that are all white, and they're called chalks. They're chalks because they're made out of these single-celled organisms, and these single-celled organisms are made out of basically calcite, and they're called coccolithophores. And these little plates of these coccoliths would just settle down to the bottom of the ocean and create these thick beds of chalk. These are brand new. They had not evolved on the planet until the Cretaceous. So you don't see chalk beds until the Cretaceous. And so these coccolithophores basically are a new food source. And they were a new food source such that the waters probably would have been almost green instead of blue with how much of these food, base of the food chain, was in the seaway. The sea was only about 200 to 300 feet deep, pretty shallow, but yet it supported a whole bunch of giant sharks, plus giant mosasaurs, which are like Komodo dragons living in the ocean, only our state fossils, Tylosaurus, it's 35 feet long as a marine reptile, We had plesiosaurs, like Elasmosaurus with the really long necks, or little Loch Ness monsters, and big-headed ones, plesiosaurs, that were also 25 feet long and were monstrous. Top predators. So we had lots of top predators, from giant fish that were 16 to 17 feet long. So to have such a diversity of giant predators, there had to be a lot of food at the base of the food chain for lots of small fish, to bigger fish, to bigger fish, to bigger fish. So we had a highly productive ocean with a lot of animals. It ended up with a lot of different huge predators. All right, this is shark vertebra, just in case. Threw it in there in case there was people in the back that couldn't see the one I was holding up. That's its little profile, so they're very thin. So you can recognize a shark vertebra if you see it sometime. And Carcharias is a different genus. These are sand sharks. There's lots of different species around today of sand tigers. But they were around back in the Cretaceous also. Got cool extra little in their denticles on either side. And there are lots of these different kinds of sharks around. I just threw a few other ones in of weird, less common teeth that you can find, but just to show that there's a huge diversity of different kinds of sharks that were living in Kansas. A much smaller one, ones that are 5 millimeters. One of the things that we do is actually, if you about 3 to 4 times a year at the Sternberg, we actually have shark hunting expeditions. So if you want to go out for a day or a night, you can keep track of us on our website or our Facebook page. You can come out and do some shark tooth hunting with us if you would like. I wonder why they call it Dalasiella. Probably the first place they found it was somewhere south of Kansas. And the main point is, whether you were in the Cretaceous or whether you were anywhere up to 2 million years ago, if you were going to be cruising around in the oceans, you were definitely going to need a bigger boat. All right. Anybody got questions? Sure.
In the previous picture of the variety of sharks, there was a Leviathan Melville.
Mhm.
Was that by chance named after Herman Melville?
It was not by chance. It was very. It was definitely named after Melville, and it was also named a little biblically for a Leviathan, and you had to have. Yep, absolutely, because it was a sperm whale. Yep. Excellent observation. Anybody else got a question? Yep.
Does sharks have like taste buds, like versus the fish versus seal? Or
You know, it's really fascinating. Whether it's their sense of receptors sort of smell or not, but they will reject things that are not very fatty. Matter of fact, they'll even, if they're going in for a whale, they'll spit some out and go back and get something that's more fatty. That's why a lot of times humans maybe get killed by great whites, for example, but they don't get eaten ever, because they're going to look for something. That's why they like the seals and sea lions, something with a whole lot of fat in them. There was actually an experiment done where they threw out behind a boat some sea lion, some goat, and some pig, and they were trolling with it. And the sharks would come up and they'd grab the goat and they'd spit it out, and they'd go back and they ate the pig and they ate the sea lion, but they didn't eat the goat. It wasn't fat enough.
Have you ever seen a great white?
I have not seen a great white. I've seen lots of different sharks, but because of this movie, when I was out scuba diving when I was in Los Angeles, because there are white sharks that go cruising around between the Channel Islands. I was out scuba diving one day and went out from the kelp and went out deeper, and I was looking at all the invertebrate life on the bottom. And my partner and I, we popped up, and there's all of a sudden a whole bunch of sea lions all around us. Ah, swimming. And I looked around, and I said, boy, there's a bunch of sea lions around here. Huh, there's a bunch of sea lions around here. And immediately went back down and back towards the coast and was pretty much done for the day. So fortunately, in that sense, I have not seen a great white.
I'm off sharks, but recently in the news they had all those whales beaching. Do you have any thoughts about that? I imagine sharks don't beach, but.
No, sharks do not usually. The whales beaching, there's a number of different possibilities, but one of them honestly has to deal with soundings from Navy ships and things like that, that sonar that drives them crazy and ends up driving them up onto beach themselves. There's other possibilities too, but that's one of them, definitely.
There was a movie on television this week that I only got to see a part of it, but I've ordered it. But Herman Melville was a character in this movie, and the name of the movie was In the Heart of the Sea. And I wondered if you had seen it. It's a pretty contemporary movie, but I have a feeling it's about whales and.
It is, as a matter of fact, yeah. No, and it's a really good movie. Everybody should watch it if you get a chance.
I wonder if Melville's tale of Moby Dick put people in fear of the Leviathans unreasonably, somewhat like Jaws has been such grand press for sharks in general.
Well, the amazing thing is movies and books make us sort of petrified of the water, but in reality, there's a lot more for great whites to fear from us than than for us to fear from them. And it's the same way. Sperm whales, the number of people that have died from a sperm whale versus how many sperm whales that were killed during the big whaling efforts in order to get the oils from the spermaceti and the large heads. So yeah, we've done lots more damage to them than they've ever done to us.
I had sort of picked up the idea that sharks were not doing very well worldwide. Do you have knowledge on that?
Sharks, many sharks are not doing very well. For a number of reasons. There's the overfishing with the shark fin soup, because you think about it, the great whites, for example, they're only reproducing every other, maybe every 3 years. They take 30 years to get to reproductive age. And they're only having pups in the 2 to 10 range at a time. And they eat themselves a lot of times. So yeah, with the reproductive rates and the time it takes to get to maturity for a lot of shark species, the rate that we're pulling them out and killing them for just their fins is amazingly crazy. And also the fact that we do have overfishing, which affects their food supplies. We're about out of tuna. A lot of species of tuna are just about extinct. So there's food supplies are down. With a lot of the climate change, we're changing water temperatures, which affects the food supply. We've got coral reefs dying. Basically, the Great Barrier Reef is dead. So there's a lot of things that, at one point in time, the idea was, we need to quit eating beef and go out and just eat fish. But the reality is that aspect of it, we've overfished so much and changed the oceans that's becoming depleted drastically, which greatly affects the shark species.
questions. I want to know how many teeth they have, first of all. And then second of all, I want to know if are there any coral reefs ever found in Kansas?
Okay, two good questions. Oh, you're fine. Several hundred teeth. Different sharks will have different numbers of teeth, but there's several hundred teeth at any given time. And the thing about it is sharks are replacing their teeth all the time. So they grab something and teeth are falling out, and they're being replaced by new teeth. So there's an endless supply of them. So if you go over a lifetime of a shark, there will have been thousands of them. But in their mouth at any one time, there's several hundred. And as far as corals go, interestingly enough, during the Cretaceous, there were lots of corals in Texas and further south. There was not a lot of corals that made it up into Kansas. One of the things that's fascinating about it is as we went into the Cretaceous, we had a huge global warming event, and it actually got too warm for corals, almost worldwide. And they were replaced by this really weird group of clams called rudistids. And some of them looked like boxing gloves with a little like mitt top and a cone-shaped bottom shell. And in Kansas, we have these cool ones called Durania, and they're a bunch of cones that grew together, and they cemented together, so they almost look like a coral. But they grew in huge colonies, but they were bivalves. And they basically replaced corals when it got too warm. But there were, earlier in the Cretaceous, there were corals. They just never really got up into Kansas because the seaway was when it was really too hot for them. And it was also, our seaway changed salinity so much that it made it tough for a lot of invertebrates that need constant salt content, constant salinity. So we had a limited number, a lower diversity of invertebrates. And it also meant that you had to have fish and sharks and things that could deal with changing temperature and changing salinity. And corals don't do well with any changing salinity or temperature. So we don't really have any. We never had a coral reef in Kansas specifically. Yeah.
How did the sharks survive the Ice Age?
Well, the really large ones didn't.
Yeah, that's one thing, because I've been curious about that. Because if most of the sharks died off during the Ice Age, how did the DNA get transferred after the Ice Age, and then sharks just popped straight back up?
Well, the thing is, the Ice Age didn't freeze the whole planet over, right? So we still had tropical areas that were plenty warm. So there was lots of species that survived the Ice Age just fine. It was these really huge, large sharks that were dependent upon eating whales and dolphins and things that were unable to survive because their prey diminished, and then they could go into cold enough waters that they couldn't follow them into those waters. So the smaller sharks that were just eating fish, there's a lot of like black tip, white tip reef sharks that could stay in the tropics and around the reefs and eat reef fish that did really well. They survived the Ice Age perfectly happily.
Maybe one more question? Sort of running a little late.
Well, see, here's the problem. I told them before we started here, I said, if you want me to talk for 15 minutes or a half hour, I need a month in advance. I said, if you want me to talk for 3 hours, I can go right now. And since they called me yesterday and said, hey, do you want to talk tomorrow? Then it got spread out. The whole being able to narrow it down kind of went out the window. So I'm sorry about that, but that's sort of how that works for me.
Well, I guess the last question might be, are presentations regular at the Sternberg on these subjects?
We have several presentations a year. I have a curator that studies Cretaceous birds, and she likes to do presentations. We also have a lot of presentations on different topics that involve whether it's the seaway or other topics of evolution. We have at least 3 free days a year. We have Darwin Day, we have Science in the Summer Day, we have National Fossil Day, where we have presentations going on all day. on different topics during the year. Hey, thank you.